In the company of Professor Alistair Rowan, we trace the history and explore the architecture of Ireland's medieval cathedrals in another chance to see the six-part series, God's Houses.
When the Normans invaded Ireland, just over 800 years ago, in 1169, one of their first objectives, once they had secured control of the country, was to strengthen the authority of the church. The Normans were highly practical people. Their political system built up in pyramid fashion to the most important single person in the realm, the king, Henry II of England, who came to Ireland in 1171. The king depended on the royal dukes and his other lords, the earls, viscounts, barons, to keep him in power. This Fitz-Osbert knight, traditionally believed to be Strongbow, is one such figure. And when King Henry turned his attention to the church, he thought in similar terms of a similar power structure. If you can control the top people in any organization, very soon you control the whole thing. For the Normans, the top people were bishops. They were the men responsible for the organization of religion throughout the whole country. If you want to give a bishop real authority, you encourage him to build a great cathedral. For a cathedral is the focus and symbol of episcopal power. I want to show you three medieval cathedrals in Ireland, still in use as Protestant churches today. Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin, where I am now. The great Cathedral of St. Mary in Limerick, founded by the King of Munster, Donal Mór O'Brien, just before the Normans took final control of the city. A massive symbolic structure rising grandly over the Shannon. And St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, built some 50 years after Christ Church and St. Mary's by Archbishop Henry of London, now the national cathedral of the Church of Ireland. All three cathedrals are laid out in the shape of a cross, the classic plan for a great church in the Middle Ages. This is Christ Church, Dublin. The longest part, or leg of the cross, is the nave where the congregation assembled, with narrow passages or aisles running down either side. It opens through a great arch into the crossing and then continues on into the chancel, the part reserved for the clergy and the high altar, which occupies the top of the cross on the plan. The arms of the cross, the transepts, divide the chancel from the nave, cutting across the body of the cathedral to create a lofty space in the interior with a room for a side chapel on the eastern walls. Christ Church was built by the Anglo-Norman priest John Comyn soon after he was appointed Archbishop of Dublin in 1181. Here, in the south transept of Comyn's church, we can see a good deal of his original work. The round-headed windows divided by short stone columns and the zigzag decoration that is typical of Norman work, but a great deal of the rest of the cathedral is more recent. Firstly, the style of the nave is different because that was built in a second building campaign starting 30 years later, about 1213. It is in an elaborate early Gothic style with pointed arches and lots of shafts attached to the piers that support the arches. But even more importantly, the whole cathedral was virtually rebuilt just over 100 years ago when the Victorian architect George Edmund Street restored the building. The choir is entirely his work, a guess at what Archbishop Common might have put up in place of a later long choir which street and Victorian taste did not like. We can appreciate just how much street did by comparing the exterior of the cathedral today, note his complex polygonal choir, with this view from the same angle drawn in 1830. In both, the cruciform shape of Christ Church remains, with the tower soaring above the crossing, but clearly most of the detail today is the Victorian architect's invention. There is one part of Christ Church which has remained almost untouched since Archbishop Common's time, the crypt or lower church, built underneath the main body of the cathedral. It is entered by a stair off the south aisle, which leads down to a sequence of low vaulted spaces divided by massive but very plain square piers, which are the foundations of the cathedral itself. The crypt of Christ Church is unique. No other church in Ireland or Britain has a vaulted basement as large as the building above it, and these spaces at Christ Church have remained essentially the same since they were first built in 1180 or 1190. A graveyard in the heart of the city of Limerick is the setting of St Mary's Cathedral. At first sight, it looks quite different from Christ Church. The exterior is really like a complicated stone box with windows of different shapes and patterns and a tall tower rising at one end. Certainly its cruciform plan is hardly apparent, but this is partly because the cathedral has never been subjected to a rigorous restoration like Christ Church. And though many Victorian architects worked here, one of the chief delights of the building is the extent to which it preserves work from many different periods in the Middle Ages. After all, there is no reason why the house of God should not be like any other house. Different ages and different generations add on bits and change others, so that we can unpick the history of the place by looking at the different parts. When it was first built, St Mary's was entered by this impressive round arched doorway. It was rebuilt in 1894, but the rebuilding is a replica, retaining these attached column shafts, we call them colonnettes, with Romanesque stylized capitals above. The west door leads directly into an impressive dark nave, built for Donald More O'Brien, somewhere between 1172 and 1194. Here we encounter the same severe taste as in the crypt at Christ Church. Massive rectangular piers support large plain arches cut through the deep wall, and the only light that comes into the nave is from plain round-headed windows set over the arches at an upper level. This is very solid, severe architecture. The only decoration on the piers is the rounded moulding at each corner and a rather plain scallop decoration at the capital, just where the arch springs. Another severe element is the clerestory. This is a range of windows with a passage that runs between them to allow access to the upper parts of the church. It is called a clerestory because these windows rise clear above the level of the roofs of the aisles on either side. The wall here is a clerestory higher than on the other parts of the church, letting light into the central part of the building. At Christ Church and at St Patrick's, the clerestory wall is elaborately decorated. Here at Limerick, it is quite primitive. Nothing more than a sequence of round-headed windows whose sides are widely splayed to diffuse the light. After the fourth arch in the nave, the clerestory stops, because it is at this point that a later builder, possibly Bishop Hubert de Burgh, added two transepts, one to the north and the other to the south, to King Donald's great church, cutting two large arched openings into the nave arcade. The present wooden backs of the choir stalls make it easy to overlook this 13th century transept inside the church, but its cruciform shape is obvious if you climb the tower and look down onto the nave and transept roofs. And from here, we can also see how the later additions of family chapels and extensions filled the whole church out to a wide rectangular plan. Our third cathedral, St. Patrick's in Dublin, is more recent than Christchurch or Limerick by about 50 years. In 1225, King Henry III granted protection for 4 years to preachers on behalf of the fabric to travel throughout all Ireland. The cathedral was begun in that year by Archbishop Henry and continued after his death by Archbishop Luke, who presided over its dedication in 1254. Like Christchurch, St. Patrick's was heavily restored in the last century, when most of the exterior walling was refaced, but the great mass of the building still conforms to its medieval shape. It is the longest church in Ireland, 300 feet in extent from the Lady Chapel in the east, past the choir and the transepts, to the spectacular tower and spire at its western end. Here we encounter a richer, more elaborate taste than at Limerick. The cathedral is similar to early 13th century Gothic work in England, with tall, narrow windows ending in sharp points. They are called lancet windows, arranged either singly or in groups of 3 or 5. Notice too the steep pitch of the gables of the roofs, far higher than you would find on a house or barn, and very much a feature of early English Gothic buildings. Built against the chancel walls are heavy buttresses that rise above the level of the aisle roofs to support, with a series of arches that fly across the space below, the top of the wall of the choir. These flying buttresses are here because the ceiling of the choir inside is vaulted in stone, and, without the buttresses to take the weight off the walls, the ceiling vault would collapse. As at Limerick, we can get a very good idea of the cruciform layout of St. Patrick's from the top of the belfry tower. From here, the tall roofs of the nave and transepts stand out clearly, with the clerestory windows below, and then the sloping roofs of the aisles running parallel to the transept and the nave. Halfway along the top of the parapet wall, where the Victorian restorers thought it would be necessary to add 2 flying buttresses, you can in fact detect a bump in the wall, just here. And this marks the spot where the north nave wall collapsed in 1380. The belfry tower, an astonishingly robust structure with massive clasping buttresses at its base, was added to the cathedral after this date by Archbishop Thomas Cranley, who had to rebuild the west end of the nave at the same time. His work is quite different in feeling. It is the only part of the exterior that was not completely restored in the last century, so that we can appreciate the vigorous texture of real medieval walling, and we can notice as well the more elaborate decorated treatment of the window opening at the top of the belfry, which is much wider than the lancets on the rest of the cathedral and is filled with delicate stone tracery. The spire at the top is a Georgian addition, built in granite by the Dublin architect George Semple in 1749, which says something for the firm foundations of Archbishop Cranley's 15th century tower. Monumental regularity characterizes the interior of St. Patrick's. The nave is impressively long, with an arcade of 8 arches opening into the aisles on either side. 2 lofty arches mark the crossing of the transepts, and then the same rhythmic pattern continues into the chancel, 4 arches deep. The chancel with its surrounding aisles is the oldest and architecturally the best part of the building. Most medieval churches began to be built from the high altar or east end. St. Patrick's is no exception, and fortunately, it is here that the most authentic work survives. In contrast to the transepts of Christ Church and the big plain nave of St. Mary's Cathedral, Limerick, the internal architecture of this chancel is much lighter, and the relative proportion of the windows and other openings in the wall surface is far greater. At Limerick, we saw that the architects had built a passage at the same level as the clerestory, passing through each window opening. But here the clerestory and passage are separated to make a three-story interior wall. Below me, there is the arcade between the chancel and the aisles, then the passage built into the blank wall, and then the clerestory itself, flooding light onto the vaults of the ceiling. The vault is a replacement built early this century by Sir Thomas Drew, but it is real, a solid structure. You can walk on top of it, unlike the Victorian plaster vault of the nave, and most of the rest of the chancel architecture is authentic work of 1225 or thereabouts. It is, of course, in the detailing of a building that its particular qualities appear. And I want to show you here a beautiful piece of design at St. Patrick's. The whole course of Gothic architecture in the later Middle Ages is marked by a greater refinement and sense of delicacy in the treatment of the structural members of a design. We have already seen the doughty rectangular columns in the crypt of Christ Church and in the nave arcade at St. Mary's, Limerick. Here, for the pier between the chancel and its aisles, the masons have used a more complicated form, an octagon, which he has then decorated by attaching shafts in the middle of each face. Finally, with a sensitivity to form that is quite breathtaking, he has sculpted a flowing line round the whole pier that sets the surface in constant rippling motion, so that in places the shafts stand out in full light and elsewhere catch the shadow. Today, as we build mostly with concrete blocks, we are not used to the artistic sophistication of our ancestors 700 years ago. So I thought it might be useful to have a look at a diagram. The mason starts with an octagon, adds column shafts in the center of each face, and then sculpts the line in a recess round the column shaft, adding stalk-like moldings at each of the angles. The result is this beautiful pier. It is a pier that is perfectly calculated to flow elegantly into the pattern of the vaulting above our heads. There is great artistry here, and if you are interested in this sort of analysis, you may like to see what a less elegant pier might look like. As work on the cathedral progressed, funds became scarcer. The designers left out the flying buttresses to support the nave, which is probably why the vault collapsed 130 years later, and they also economized in the sculpture of the piers. This is a typical pier in the nave arcade. It misses the stem-like sprouts at the corner, has a simpler base, and is altogether less elegant. While up at the west end of the cathedral, in the 15th century rebuilding, we actually have 4 octagonal shafts that are almost plain. We cannot leave St. Patrick's without a word about the fact that Dublin has 2 medieval cathedrals, and without an explanation of these elaborate stalls. It is very unusual for a bishop, still less an archbishop, to have 2 cathedrals. There are 2 in Dublin because of rivalries between the chapter of Christ Church, which had an Irish Augustinian monastery attached to it, and the Anglo-Norman archbishops from John Comyn's day on. Comyn and Henry of London found it easier to cope with a secular, non-monastic chapter, peopled by their own men. And from their time onwards, when the old church of St. Patrick's was demolished and this new cathedral was built, no Augustinian canon of Christ Church was ever elected Archbishop of Dublin. Of course, the two bodies of clerics quarrelled endlessly until the Pope Nicholas III intervened, declaring Christ Church to be the mother church of the Dublin diocese, where all future archbishops should be consecrated. Nonetheless, in the struggle for power, St. Patrick's won the day, and these choir stalls prove it. They are the stalls of the Knights of the Most Noble Order of St. Patrick, an order invented by King George III in 1783 to honour eminent Irishmen. Since 1922, no new knights have been created. People can gain honorary degrees at the National University instead, and the Order of St. Patrick has passed into history, leaving only these rather picturesque banners and crests behind. For genuine medieval stalls, we have to return to St. Mary's, Limerick. Here in the choir is preserved a magnificent series of late Gothic medieval seats. They were installed by Bishop John Folan in the late 15th century when he renovated the building. The upper sections are modern, but the seats themselves date from about 1490. They are almost 500 years old and are the only surviving sets of medieval stalls in Ireland. These seats are called misericords, from the Latin word for compassion or pity, and are designed so that a person can half sit, half stand by resting on a little shelf placed on purpose under the seat so that it projects when the seat is tipped up. Thus, the rigours of a lengthy medieval service were a little reduced, and by tradition, the underside of the shelf is often carved with entertaining or grotesque scenes. Here we have a griffin, an eagle, a lion attacking a mythical beast, and yet another mythical beast, this time with wings, paws, and a human face. I suspect that the master craftsman who carved the misericords was also responsible for the decoration of the Sexton Chapel, added to the south side of the south aisle. This is a lintel taken from the chapel. It is carved in very much the same sharp-edged style as the misericords, with the symbol of Christ, the pelican feeding its young from its breast, and the seven-headed beast, the symbol of the Antichrist, as described in the Apocalypse, facing each other across a keystone. In the 15th and 16th centuries, many important Limerick merchants and citizens, like the Sextons and the Arthurs, built family chapels onto the north and south sides of the cathedral. These are lit by big windows filled with elaborate tracery. Near these chapels, on the south wall of the south transept, two delightful pieces of late Gothic work survive. The first is this triple arcade of seats for the clergy, a sedilia or sitting place, with each seat divided by a limestone shaft, beautifully carved with spirals, as you see here. Irish limestone takes a wonderfully sharp edge, which it will hold for centuries. And we see this again in this elaborate canopied tomb to Richard Baltingford and Geoffrey Galway. Baltingford was thrice mayor of Limerick, and Galway died here in 1414. The monument is decorated with delicate angel stops holding shields, and provides a large covered recess in which a recumbent effigy was placed. It was erected by Baltingford's daughter, Margaret, and Galway's son, Edmund, who probably were a married couple, but we have no way of telling which parent's effigy was placed in the recess. The last monument to notice in Limerick is not a relic of the medieval past, but a showy piece of architectural display set up in the chancel beside the high altar. It dates from 1678 and was reassembled by Henry O'Brien, the second Earl of Thomond, and put up in memory of his father, the first Earl. By the time the Thomond monument went up, great changes had taken place in the Irish church and also in Irish architecture. Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth had suppressed the monasteries and had established an Anglican version of the Catholic faith. Roman Catholics were no longer to worship in Limerick Cathedral, and as if to emphasize the new regime, Lord Thomond's monument is in a new style too. Its columns, rich capitals and cornices are in a classical, non-medieval style, and it is in these classical forms that the future churches of the Irish 18th century will be built.